I love movies like Ocean's 11 and Heat, old 50s heist movies like Rififi, The Asphalt Jungle, and I thought to myself, can I do that? You know, I think these guys have so much fun coming up with the capers and the characters, and so it's really just trying to do my own spin on a crime novel, and then my preoccupations take over. Ray Carney, the main character, appears, and it becomes its own sort of new thing.
On Washington Post Live. I am Jonathan Capehart, associate editor at the Washington Post. My guest today is a genius, a MacArthur genius and a literary genius, a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and now he's the author of Crook Manifesto, the second installment of his Harlem trilogy, and this is him right there, Colson Whitehead. Welcome to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
How do you do? Thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, first, before we even get into the book, I have to tell you that as a political science nerd, I don't read fiction. I read history and I read political books until someone said, read Underground Railroad. And then next thing I knew, I've got stacks of your books on my bedside table. So just my saying that, your reaction to pulling me over to the other side, to embracing fiction?
Well, I write different kinds of stories. I have a zombie story, I have historical fiction, and now I'm writing crime fiction. But apart from their genre labels, I'm pulling in critiques of capitalism, institutional structures, class, and so they start off with a very simple premise and then spin out as I sort of work in my various critiques about how we live and how we treat each other.
Actually, that's how you hooked me, because even though it's fiction, it's rooted in facts and truth and history. So thank you for that. Let's talk about Crook Manifesto. It's set in the 1960s. I'm sorry, Harlem Shuffle is set in the 1960s. Crook Manifesto picks up where? In the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing it as a trilogy. So following this character, Ray Carney, in the 1960s, and then 1970s, then 1980s, and also New York City in those different periods, a time of boom and bust. And so, when all is said and done, I'll have traced one character for 30 years, and also the life of a city and how they parallel and reflect each other.
So I've taken from your answer, so the end of the trilogy will be the 80s. I'm just wondering, why didn't you set it up this way?
I started off with, very simply just wanting to try my hand at a heist novel, and then I kept coming up with different adventures for Ray Carney. So the first book became 3 different stories linked together. I kept coming up with more, and so that became a second book in the 1970s with 3 more stories interlinked. And if you do 2, you might as well do 3. So it became a trilogy. Once you've gone, like, what's 2 books? I don't know what that is, but a trilogy. There's a good tradition. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. Let's do a trilogy.
So you've mentioned his name several times. I know who Ray Carney is. Tell the folks who are watching and listening who Ray Carney is.
He's a fence. A fence is someone who takes stolen goods and then recirculates them into polite legal society. So the heisters, steal $2 million in gems. They've been shot. They're being pursued by the police. And then they go to the fence to get money for them. And the fence always says, I'll give you 10 cents on the dollar. So there's not a lot of fiction or movies about fences and how they work. And they have one foot in legal society and one foot in the crooked world. And the possibilities of that psychology were very, very promising and alluring. And so he became the main character, and he's the anchor of the series.
Right. And so in Crook Manifesto, you have it broken down in 3 parts, 71, 73, and then 76. Why structure the novel around those three specific years?
I knew it would be the 70s, so I'm trying to find what moments in New York history can I exploit for Ray Carney. Um, if you've seen the movie Serpico, 1971 was a moment where there was a big anti corruption force in New York City, the Knapp Commission. And so that provides the background for the first story. There's a corrupt policeman who pulls in Carney into his adventures. 1976, bicentennial year, if you remember, those of us who were around the red, white, and blue fervor of that year. And of course, um, we're forced to think about how do we live or not live up to the Declaration of Independence, the principles of the founding of our country. And so there's a moment there for critique and investigation of what it means to be an American, a Black American in 1976. So I'm going through newspaper headlines, trying to figure out what will serve the story, and and hopefully it pays off for Carney.
Mm-hmm. I sort of jumped ahead of myself by asking you to talk about each of those years, but let's go back to 71, which is the start of the book, and talk a little bit more about Ray Carney, because how is he different in Crook Manifesto than he is in Harlem Shuffle?
Sure, he grew up poor. His father was a criminal, and that was his model for manhood. And so he wants to have a upstanding business on 125th Street in Harlem, a furniture store. He wants to be a good family man. He wants to be a good husband, but there's always a voice in the back of his head saying, "Let's do some crimes." Listen to us, Carney. Do some crimes. And so, at the opening of the second book, he's renounced his days as a fence. He's gone on the straight and narrow until it's 1971. His teenage daughter wants Jackson 5 tickets. They're on a big world tour. They're coming to New York, playing with the Commodores, who are not really well known at that moment. They're the opening act. And his daughter wants tickets. It's sold out. So he has to go to this corrupt cop who's a fixer in New York in order to get tickets. And then, of course, there's a high price. And what I love about this genre is that we all know the story of the gangster who wants to go straight and then they pull him back in. So I have fun with that. Carney has tried to renounce his bad ways, but the life is always calling him back.
Hmm. And so everyone seems to be in on the criminality. But the way they get to participate in the criminality reflects their social status, right? How do social status, criminality, and corruption collide in the first part of the book?
Well, I mean, it's it's all over both books. There are street level criminals, and then I pull back and meet the corrupt black upper crust in Harlem, crooked lawyers, crooked politicians, and then I pull back to Wall Street, and we meet the real estate fat cats, the Wall Street moguls who are engaged in a higher level corruption. So whether the stakes are very low or stakes are in the millions, a lot of the cast is pretty involved in various shenanigans and criminal activities, and we're forced to think, how bad is the guy who breaks into the storefront compared to these larger crimes, the
Hmm.
rich and powerful? Where does everybody fall on this scale of corruption?
So 1973. Where do we find Harlem, Ray, and his partner in crime, Pepper?
Pepper is like a sort of a Yoda figure, a seasoned criminal who was a running buddy of Ray Carney's father, and he's very taciturn. He's very semi sociopathic. Has a unique perspective on life and criminality. So I give him his showcase, and he's hired to do security for a black exploitation film in Harlem. I used to be a pop culture critic, so it was really fun to go back to these movies that I watched when I was a kid, Shaft, Superfly, Coffee, and figure out how to make it work as a plot. And so the star of the black exploitation film in the book goes missing, and Pepper is sort of called in to look for her. And so there's another level of critique of Hollywood, One of the characters is a Richard Pryor type character named Roscoe Pope, a comedian who's about to blow up. And in the same way that Richard Pryor starred in exploitation movies, is finding his way into Hollywood. And of course, we know if we fast forward 10 years, what happens to Richard Pryor. So it's another way of seeing how people are sort of chewed up and spat out, whether it's the criminal life, Hollywood life, New York politics, another way of looking at a different level of corruption.
Speaking of Richard Pryor, you talk about those movies like, I mean, is one of them Which Way Is Up? The movies he did, the series of movies he did with Sidney Poitier.
That's a little later. You know, he did stuff with Billy D. Williams, like a movie called Hit, and he's sort of wise talking. He's not even a star. He's a very low level supporting player, but he's about to blow up. You know, his concert records 75, 76, the movie Silver Streak. So I'm capturing him at a moment when he's finding his genius and also starting to reckon with the price of fame.
Mm-hmm. Let's stick to 73 for a moment, because I'm wondering, how did you do research for the book? And as you're writing this and you're researching, did you learn things about Harlem that you didn't already know?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in New York City and lived in Harlem when I was very little, but I never hung out there as a grown up, and so I'm really engaged in finding different places in the city that can serve the story. Where does Carney live? Where's his office? You know, I was writing during the pandemic, so I was wearing my mask on the street, the only person out there, going around avenue to avenue, thinking, I guess you could dump a body here, or here's a good warehouse to stuff a hostage for a couple days. So there's this great history of Harlem that I had to learn, and then figure out how to deploy for my characters. And a lot of research I could have gone to my parents for. They were a young couple in Harlem in the '60s, raising a family. The first book has the Hotel Teresa, which was a famous
Oh yeah.
hotel where
Yep.
Black celebrities lived. And on the first floor was a Chock Full of Nuts, the old coffee chain. So I wrote these scenes, and I would tell my mom, like, "Oh yeah, I'm writing about the Hotel Teresa and Chock Full of Nuts," and she's like, "Oh yeah, I was there every day. I worked around the corner." So it's also rediscovering my parents' Harlem, which is pretty neat.
Hmm. But I mean, then that gets to the whole conversation about Harlem today and the demographic changes that have hit Harlem, in particular as a result of gentrification. How much has Harlem changed from what it was in the 60s and 70s?
Well, yeah, I mean, I describe 125th Street, Kearny's Harlem, very vividly, and trying to get it right. And all those storefronts don't exist anymore. As in every big boulevard across the world, there's the Nike store, the Shake Shack, and the Gap. So it really could be anywhere. But it's also a continuity, because if you go 2 blocks up to 127th, they're the same brownstones and townhouses that were built 140 years ago, and they're untouched from the outside, inside our apartments. But all that stuff is still there, even when with the corporate takeover. And before Harlem became Black Harlem, it was a refuge for white Europeans, German, Italian, Jewish, and then they ascended the economic ladder, left New York City, moved to the suburbs, and there's an influx of Black Americans from the South. And then 120 years later, now, we're talking about gentrified Harlem. Some of those, young kids coming to Harlem now for the cheap rents and the nice cafes are the descendants, the great grandkids of that first immigrant group, and which I find, kind of lovely. That's the narrative continues with a new generation. And for me, despite all the corporate gentrification, it's kind of lovely.
Hmm. It's sort of the perennial New York story. New York is always changing, but the cast of characters who flow in and out of the city during its history have ancestors who were there before them, whether they know it or not.
No, totally. I mean, and I've done some family research, and I was able to find where my grandmother, who came from Barbados in the 1920s through Ellis Island, lived in Harlem, and I'm putting that address in a later part of the book. But it's lovely to, I think, commemorate that in his books, and then also discover my own history and doing research.
So now the third part of the book is 1976. You touched on this earlier about sort of the complicated relationship between African Americans and America on America's 200th birthday. I'm just wondering, put your political analytical hat on, and would Crook Manifesto's 1976 chapters change at all if you were to change it to 2023?
Well, there's still the attempt to sanitize American history. Obviously, if we're talking about 1776, we're not talking about slavery and the founding fathers, having owning a lot of people. And if we look at the headlines now, in Florida, for example, uh, basically banning talking about the reality of slavery, and the truth of our American history. We shouldn't shy away from it. It's what happened, and we're only going to repeat our mistakes if we don't learn from it. And so, 1976 is a big salute to our founding principles. How much are we actually living up to them? And still, in 2023, we're still engaged in this, purposeful looking away. We don't want to face our true national origin.
We have an audience question that I was going to ask you later, and it comes from Canada. But given what we're talking about now, let me put this up. This is a question from Stephen Mora from Canada. And Stephen asks, some classes in my high school in Canada study the Nickel Boys. What would you want students to know about writing stories, either professionally or for the joy of it? And in that, I bring this question up now because, I could see how the Nickel Boys or even the Underground Railroad or maybe even any of your books could get caught up in this hysteria over CRT, and making white kids feel bad about learning about the nuances and complexities and truth of American history.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to make anyone feel bad. I'm delighted that Underground and Nickel Boys have found an audience in high schools and colleges. The Underground Railroad has a fantastic element that sort of roves around different moments in our history. And so it's an opportunity to talk about not just slavery, but forced sterilization, eugenics, scientific racism. Nazi racial theorists borrowed language and ideas from American scientists to justify the extermination of Jews. And so that book becomes a jumping off for a lot of different kind of conversations, and I'm glad. And I have gone to schools where they're teaching the Nickel Boys, and the teacher who brought me in is like, there was some debate among the school board members, whether or not to teach the Nickel Boys. So I haven't heard about it being banned, but it is it's incendiary. I'm not really sure why. It's just a story about how America came to be, but people are very touchy about it. And so we go through these phases in American history. The communists in the 50s are perverting our kids' minds. Late 80s, early 90s, the multiculturalists, the politically correct crowd is trying to get rid of Shakespeare. And now we have this anti-CRT hysteria. And art's always under attack. And there's that war between progressive values and reactionary values. So it's a really old story. This moment I recognize from 20 years ago when I was in college and from reading about the 1950s. And we come out of it, but we have to be vigilant and we have to fight.
It's one thing to be in this period and watch these discussions and watch what's being done to authors in their books, and it's another thing to live it. For you to hear about people debating about whether your book should even be taught in schools. And this brings up another audience question. This one is from Connecticut, from Danielle Teplika. I'm sorry, Danielle, for mispronouncing your last name, but she asks, how do you care for your writer's mind? Have you found a balance between keeping up with news and politics and giving your mind other options?
I definitely, decompress, and so I wrote two very serious books back to back, The Underground Railroad and The Nickel Boys. The Nickel Boys was based on a really terrible real life incident about a repressive and abusive uh, boys' school in Florida, and I finished it, and I was depressed and depleted, and then I played video games and barbecued for 2 months, and that was my self care. And so, not all my books are that serious, and there's a lot of humor in Crook Manifesto and Harlem Shuffle, and I'm very grateful for that. I get to make weird jokes about pepper and pop culture and New York City politics and being a human being. And so, depending on the work, there's room for humor and or sometimes not. It's part of the job. But I can always kick back and watch some TV, have a glass of wine, or play some video games, and that keeps
Hmm.
me sane.
Yeah, I was about to ask do you drink? What's your favorite drink of choice? But the other thing I like about your books, and particularly Harlem Shuffle and now Crook Manifesto, is that you get to tell jokes and you get to tell different kinds of stories, but it is decidedly black. I'm reading the pages and I hear my family, I hear my relatives, I see myself, I see some of my friends, and maybe it's because I'm now an old man and I can see these things and it's always been there, but it's something when I'm sitting there, either reading in a lawn chair or propped up on a pillow in bed at night, and a smile breaks out over my face because you put in a turn of phrase that I've only heard said among my relatives or just among Black folks. Do you hear a lot of that from fans of your writing?
Well, yeah, there's that recognition if you do it right. I mean, I think what's great about my job is that I get to leave myself, and then hopefully, if I can find the right words, take a very individual story that's in here in my head, and then bring it to other people. So I'm really glad when people recognize themselves or their family or New York City or a certain way of being in the world. That's part of what I strive for, that kind of communication.
Um, I'm looking at, we're running out of time and I've got like 4 questions to ask you. So one more on the book. Which comes first, the plot or the characters?
The plot or the proposition. So, say Underground Railroad. What if it actually was a literal train beneath the earth? Wouldn't that be weird? And so that's before there's Cora, the Caesar, all the characters I bring in there. Just an idea that stays with me. Wouldn't that be interesting? Or the Nickel Boys. This is a terrible tragedy. What would it have been like to be at this place, and what year, and who are the main characters? So before I have any of the cast, it's a notion that I want to explore and then research and flesh out.
All right, so here are the quick and dirty questions. So last I read, the Nickel Boys is being adapted into a film. Writers and actors are on strike right now. Can you give us a status update and speak to your involvement in the feature adaptation?
Yeah, with that adaptation, I didn't have anything to do with it. I was working on Harlem Shuffle and Crook Manifesto, so that's my day job. But they shot it last winter. They're editing it, and I think they're trying to get it ready for festivals in the fall. So
Mhm.
I haven't seen it yet, but I'm really excited. The first adaptation, Underground Railroad, by Barry Jenkins, went so well. So I'm pretty eager to see how it turned out.
And speaking of that, because that was going to be my next question. Talk a little bit to us about the process of trusting someone else to adapt your work and then experience seeing it on screen.
Well, I felt with Underground, I was ready to give it over, and Barry Jenkins was so capable, and all the ideas he had about adapting it were smart. You have to make changes, and all of his solutions are really perfect. But I was not prepared for actually seeing it. It's on Amazon Prime, and uh, we were still in the pandemic, and we got the tapes, and I was just amazed and so honored that this incredible heist crew he's assembled, from the set designers, the guy who does the period black haircuts,
Hmm.
um, the cast, the composers. They spent 2.5 years bringing it to life, and it's one of the most wonderful things that's ever happened to me.
It must be an incredible honor to see your work go from the printed page to the screen, however big that screen however big that screen is. Let
Sure.
me
Yeah.
get you let me get you on AI, because there's a point of contention in the writer and actor strikes is the use of AI. Um, Comedian Sarah Silverman, the novelist Mona Awad, and Paul Tremblay have sued AI companies, basically saying their work has been used to train or refine their AI models without their permission. How are you thinking about the ascent of AI and how your work might be used in its development?
Well, definitely the technology is there to capture an actor and then use them, forever. You've digitized them, and you can. The technology is there to manipulate the image. It's not there with writing yet. If you read um, fiction created by these computers, it's always so terrible. It's like you spent billions of dollars to create bad creative writing students. Was there a shortage? So I'm not worried about my job at the moment. Maybe people are always like, "Well, 10 years from now." I was like, all right, well, 10 years from now, I could be ready to retire. But obviously, things are pretty terrible at the moment. So I hope the strike comes through and they get their demands.
hmm So 5,000 authors and, have signed a petition asking tech companies to get consent from and give credit and compensation to writers whose books were used in training data. You are not a signatory. Why not?
Actually, I hadn't heard about it, frankly. So I'll have to. I'm in my own weird bubble, so I'll have to get on that.
Okay, okay. So the answer to that is he'll follow up. Last question for
Yes,
you,
yeah.
Colson. You've explored a variety of themes and topics and periods and places as we've discussed over the course of your career. Is there a period, place, or topic you've had your eye on but haven't had a chance to dive into it yet?
I haven't. Yeah, I worked in a lot of genres. I haven't worked in a romance, so I have an idea for like a romantic story set on the eve of the Russian Revolution, and there are a lot of white people in it. So for research, I'm watching The Golden Girls, sort of binging
Wait, what?
decades,
Hold on,
just seeing
hold
how
on.
Blanche and her
Wait,
crew.
wait,
You gotta
Colson.
do research, and so
We're going overtime. How you can't go and say I'm romance on the eve of the Russian Revolution and Golden Girls is your
I'm just
what?
trying to get into the white folks' heads by watching some seminal art by them, like the Golden Girls. That makes sense to me.
Oh my God, that is the best. I'm sorry, I interrupted you while you were going on about this romance novel. Have you started it yet?
um, I'll get to it once I finish the Carney stuff.
All right. What this is, and I swear this is the last question. Um, the last in the trilogy will be in the 1980s. And so, do you already have the tent pole years for that would comprise the story of the third in the trilogy?
I do, yeah. I mean, I have the major moments plotted out, and so I'm writing toward the end. Once I figured it was a trilogy, it would behoove me to figure out the last moments of Carney's story. So I'm always writing towards that last moment of the last book. So I'm halfway through the first section, and once fall comes and I'm done promoting, I'll get back to work. So I'm pretty excited.
Wow. Colson Whitehead, Pulitzer Prize winning author of Crook Manifesto. I'm sorry, two-time Pulitzer Prize winning author of Crook Manifesto. Thank you so much for coming to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
No, thanks for having me and indulging my weird humor.
It's not weird if I'm laughing. We have the same humor. Colson Whitehead, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us. To check out what interviews we have coming up, head to WashingtonPostLive.com. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at The Washington Post. Thank you for watching Capehart on Washington Post Live.